There is a microgeneration that sits in the space between two worlds, claimed fully by neither, understood completely by no one except themselves. They are called Zillennials, born between 1993 and 1998, old enough to remember a childhood before social media, young enough to have had their entire adolescence consumed by it. They are too young to be millennials, who at least had college to figure themselves out in private. They are too old to be Gen Z, who never knew a world without the performance. They are the generation caught precisely in between, and what makes them psychologically distinct is not just when they were born, but what was happening to the world during the exact years they were becoming themselves. Zillennials are the only humans in history who went through puberty, the most psychologically vulnerable, identity-forming years of life, at the exact moment social media arrived and made every stage of that process public, permanent, and subject to an audience's judgment. The selfie you posted at 14, trying to figure out how you wanted to look, is still out there. The opinion you had at 16, before you knew better, is archived. The relationship drama at 17, the friend breakup at 15, the embarrassing phase at 13, all of it documented, all of it potentially resurfaced, all of it part of a digital record that you did not choose to create but cannot fully erase. What this means psychologically is that Zillennials did not just experience adolescence, they performed it. And the performance changed the experience in ways that researchers are only beginning to understand. When you know you are being watched, when you know that the version of yourself you are trying out might be screenshotted and shared, when you know that your social value is being measured in real time through likes and comments, you do not experiment freely. You curate carefully. And the self that emerges from curation is not the same as the self that emerges from exploration. The question that haunts Zillennials more than any other generation is this: who would I have become if I had been allowed to become myself in private? And the answer is unknowable, because the conditions that would have allowed that kind of formation no longer existed by the time they hit puberty. The adolescence that could not be forgotten. There is a reason that every generation before Zillennials got to leave their teenage years behind. Adolescence is supposed to be temporary. It is supposed to be the phase you grow out of, the version of yourself you do not have to be anymore once you figure out who you actually are. The cringe, the mistakes, the bad haircuts, the ill-advised crushes, the phases you went through, all of it was supposed to fade into memory, soften with time, and eventually become stories you could laugh about because they were no longer you. Zillennials do not get that mercy. Their adolescence is not a memory, it is a searchable archive. The photos they posted at 13 trying to look cool are still on the internet. The statuses they wrote at 15 trying to sound deep can be scrolled back to. The videos they uploaded at 17, documenting a version of themselves they have since outgrown, are still there, tagged with their name, waiting to be found by a future employer, a future partner, a future version of themselves who wishes that past version could just be left in the past. What previous generations experienced as the natural process of outgrowing adolescence, Zillennials experience as a haunting. You cannot fully leave behind a version of yourself that is still publicly accessible. You cannot grow past a phase when the evidence of that phase is permanent. And the psychological cost of this is a specific kind of shame that earlier generations did not have to carry. The shame of being held accountable forever for who you were when you were still figuring out how to be a person. This is not about being embarrassed by old photos, although that is part of it. This is about the developmental need to experiment, to fail, to be wrong, to try on identities and discard them, and having that need met with a system that archives everything and forgets nothing. Adolescents need permission to be stupid, to be wrong, to be messy, because that is how they learn who they are not before they figure out who they are. Zillennials were the first generation denied that permission, and the result is a generation that is extraordinarily self-conscious, hyper-aware of how they are being perceived, and unable to fully trust that they are allowed to change. Too young for one, too old for the other. Zillennials occupy a unique psychological space. They do not fully belong to the generation that came before them, and they do not fully belong to the generation that came after them. They are what researchers call a microgeneration, and the defining feature of a microgeneration is not just when you were born, but the feeling of being caught between two worlds that do not quite fit. Millennials, born 1981 to 1992, at least had the early years of their 20s to figure themselves out in relative privacy. They got to make their biggest mistakes, form their identities, and establish their sense of self before social media became ubiquitous. By the time Instagram and Facebook took over, millennials were adults. They adopted, but they adopted as people who already knew who they were. Gen Z, born 1997 and later, never knew a world without social media. They were raised inside it from childhood. It is the only reality they have ever known, and while that comes with its own psychological costs, it at least comes with a kind of fluency. Gen Z is native to the performance in ways that feel natural to them because they never experienced an alternative. Zillennials had both and neither. They remember the before, the childhood without smartphones, the summers without documentation, the friendships that existed only in person and in memory. They know what privacy felt like because they had it, briefly, and then it was taken away at exactly the moment they needed it most. And because they remember the before, the loss of it is more acute. They are not native to the performance the way Gen Z is. They had to learn it during adolescence, which means they experienced it as an imposition rather than as a given. The belonging paradox creates a specific loneliness. Millennials do not fully understand what Zillennials went through because millennials got to have private teenage years. Gen Z does not fully understand either because Gen Z never had privacy to lose. Zillennials are the generation that sits in the gap, and the psychological experience of that gap is the feeling of being slightly out of sync with everyone around you, too young to relate fully to one cohort, too old to relate fully to the other, and perpetually explaining yourself to people who were shaped by conditions just different enough that they can't quite see what you're describing.
4. The before and the after in a single lifetime. What makes Zillennials psychologically distinct is not just that they experienced both analog and digital worlds, but when they experienced each. Childhood for Zillennials was the last gasp of the old world. They played outside until the streetlights came on. They passed notes in class. They called each other on landlines and had to ask a parent for permission to talk. They experienced boredom without the option of scrolling. They had friendships that lived entirely in person and in memory, never archived, never performed for an audience. And then, right as puberty hit, the world changed. Facebook launched in 2004 when the oldest Zillennials were 11. Instagram launched in 2010 when they were 17. Snapchat in 2011. The smartphone became ubiquitous right around 2010-2012, exactly when Zillennials were navigating high school. They went from having an analog childhood to a digital adolescence with almost no transition period in between. The psychological significance of this timing cannot be overstated. Adolescence is the period of life when identity formation is most active, when the prefrontal cortex is still developing, when the brain is learning how to regulate emotions and form a stable sense of self. It is the period when you are most vulnerable to external influence, most desperate for social acceptance, most uncertain about who you are. And Zillennials experienced that period inside a technology that was designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. The result is a generation that knows two things at once. They know what life was like without constant connectivity because they remember it, and they know what it feels like to lose that and not be able to get it back. They are nostalgic for a childhood they had and grieving for a teenage experience they did not. And that combination, memory of the before, lived experience of the after, creates a psychological duality that neither millennials nor Gen Z fully share. 5. Who are you when no one is watching? The question that every adolescent must answer is, who am I when I am not performing for my parents, my peers, or the world? What do I actually believe? What do I actually feel? What do I actually want? The process of answering that question is what creates an authentic self, a version of you that is not contingent on approval, not dependent on audience, not constructed for external consumption, but discovered through internal exploration. Zillennials were asked to answer that question while living inside a system that made internal exploration almost impossible. How do you discover who you are when every version of yourself you try out is being observed, judged, and recorded? How do you experiment with identity when the experimentation is public? How do you figure out what you believe when every belief you express is subject to immediate feedback from people who may or may not know you, may or may not care about you, but whose opinions are quantified and presented to you as social data? The answer is you do not, or at least you do not in the way previous generations did. What you do instead is perform a version of yourself that you think will be well received, and then, because adolescence is the period when the line between performance and identity is most blurred, that performed version begins to feel like you. You lose track of where the performance ends and the person begins. You forget what you wanted before you knew what other people wanted from you. This is the authentic self-crisis of the Millennials. They reached adulthood without being entirely sure who they are underneath the performance, because the performance started so early and was so constant that it became indistinguishable from selfhood. And the crisis is not that they are fake or inauthentic in some moral sense. The crisis is that they genuinely do not know how to access the version of themselves that exists independently of an audience, because that version was never allowed to fully form.
6. The most vulnerable years, exposed to everyone else's highlight reel. Adolescence has always been a period of intense social comparison. Teenagers have always been acutely aware of where they stand in the social hierarchy, how they measure up to their peers, whether they are attractive enough, cool enough, successful enough. This is developmentally normal. What is not normal is experiencing that comparison inside a system that allows you to see everyone else's curated best at all times, while you are living inside your own unfiltered reality. Zillennials went through puberty, the period of maximum physical and emotional insecurity, while also being exposed to the perfectly edited, carefully filtered, strategically presented lives of everyone they knew and thousands of people they did not. Instagram told them what beauty was supposed to look like. Facebook told them what success was supposed to look like. Snapchat told them what a fun, desirable social life was supposed to look like. And at 14, 15, 16 years old, when you are already uncertain about whether you are enough, that constant exposure to other people's highlight reels creates a baseline of inadequacy that is extraordinarily difficult to overcome. The psychological research on social comparison and adolescent mental health is clear. Constant exposure to idealized images during the period of identity formation creates lasting damage to self-esteem, increases rates of anxiety and depression, and produces a chronic sense of not-enoughness that persists into adulthood. Zillennials were the first generation to experience this at scale, during the exact years when they were most vulnerable to it, and the effects are measurable and ongoing. And what makes it worse is that they were not just consuming other people's performances, they were creating their own. They were both the audience and the performer, both the comparer and the compared, and that dual role created a feedback loop that was almost impossible to escape. You post something hoping to measure up. You see someone else's post and feel inadequate. You try again, more carefully curated this time. The cycle repeats. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the question, am I enough as I actually am, becomes almost impossible to answer, because you have spent so many years trying to become enough for an audience that the actual you has been buried under the performance. 7. When adolescence becomes content instead of experience. Human memory is supposed to be personal, subjective, and fluid. You remember the feeling of a moment more than the exact details. You remember the people you were with, the emotions you felt, the sense of what it was like to be there. Memory is internal, and that interiority is what makes it yours. But for Zillennials, many of their most important teenage memories are not stored internally, they are stored externally on platforms as photos and videos and posts that were created not to preserve the experience, but to perform it.
When you experience something while simultaneously documenting it for an audience, you are not fully present in the experience. Part of your attention is on framing the shot, choosing the angle, thinking about the caption, anticipating how it will be received. The experience becomes content, and content is fundamentally different from memory. Memory is for you. And when your adolescence is lived as content rather than as experience, something essential is lost. Zillennials now have the strange experience of looking back at their teenage years through a carefully curated archive that doesn't feel entirely theirs. The photos they see are the ones they chose to post, which means they are the moments they decided were worth sharing, not necessarily the moments that mattered most. The story they can tell about their adolescence is the one they performed, not the one they lived. And the gap between those two things creates a kind of existential confusion. Did I actually have fun at that party, or did I just perform having fun? Was that friendship real, or was it content? Did I feel what I said I felt, or did I say I felt it because that is what the post required? This is the memory problem of Zillennials. Their adolescence is over-documented and under-experienced. They have more evidence of their teenage years than any generation before them, and less access to what those years actually felt like.
8. Finding authenticity on the other side.
If you are a Zillennial, the work ahead of you is not about going back and recovering a privacy you cannot retrieve or an adolescence you cannot redo. The work is about recognizing what was taken from you, grieving it, and then choosing to build something different now in adulthood, where you finally have the control you did not have as a teenager. The first step is permission. You are allowed to be angry that your teenage years were colonized by a system that prioritized engagement over your well-being. You are allowed to grieve the version of yourself you might have become if you had been given the privacy to figure it out without an audience. You are allowed to feel robbed, because you were. The second step is excavation. Who are you when no one is watching? Not who do you perform being, not who do you think you should be, but who are you when the camera is off and the audience is gone? That question is harder for Zillennials than it is for other generations, because the camera was never off and the audience was never gone during the years when that question is supposed to be answered. But it can still be answered now. It just requires you to deliberately create the privacy you were denied, to stop performing long enough to see what emerges when you do not have to. The third step is choosing differently. You cannot undo your documented adolescence, but you can stop extending that documentation into every moment of your adult life. You can choose to experience things without posting them. You can choose to have thoughts that are not shared. You can choose to exist without an audience, and in doing so, you can begin to build the authentic self that was interrupted. And the final step is forgiving yourself for the years you spent performing, because you were a child inside a system designed to exploit you, and you did what you had to do to survive it. The performance was not your fault, the documentation was not your choice, and the self you are now building, the one that is private, authentic, and yours, that self was always there. It just needed the space to emerge. If you are a Zillennial, you are not confused about who you are because something is wrong with you. You are working through the psychological aftermath of having your identity formation hijacked by a technology that arrived at precisely the wrong moment. You lost your teenage privacy at the exact developmental stage when privacy is most essential. You performed yourself into existence before you had the chance to discover yourself in private. And you carry the weight of an adolescence that cannot be forgotten because it was documented and archived and made permanent before you were old enough to consent to any of it. But you also carry something else. You carry the memory of what life was like before the performance. You remember boredom, privacy, friendships that existed only in the moment and in memory. You know what was lost, which means you know what is possible. And that knowledge, that dual awareness of what was and what became, is the thing that will allow you to build something different now. You are deeper than you know, and the self you are searching for was never actually lost.
It was just waiting for you to create the space where it could finally be found.